Hello, everyone, and welcome to Orthodoxy. My name is Andy Schmidt. In this episode, I got to talk with Jill Nelson. Jill is a correspondent for WORLD Magazine. She is a graduate of World Journalism Institute and the University of Texas at Austin. Jill has focused a lot of her writings on foreign affairs, and in this episode, we actually discuss the wars in both Ukraine versus Russia and the war in Israel versus Hamas. We break down the history of each of these wars and discuss how Christians should think through geopolitical conflicts like these. I had a great time talking with Jill, and I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I am here with Jill Nelson, and today's podcast is going to be a wide-ranging podcast. We're going to be talking about the foreign affairs, the geopolitical landscape, the wars in Israel and in Ukraine, and hopefully we'll be able to cover as much as we possibly can. It's a lot to cover for one podcast. But before we get into this conversation, Jill, do you want to tell people about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I think these are important topics to discuss. But yes, I work for World News Group. We have a magazine that just transitioned from bi-monthly to monthly with a little heftier, thicker magazine. And we also have a daily podcast, news podcast, and we update our website daily with news. So I write primarily for the magazine and the podcast. I cover international stories, and a large majority of those stories have been about the Middle East and about Ukraine.
Yeah. What was it? Why do you cover international? I mean, what was it about? What drew you to the international political scene compared to here in the United States?
I have always been fascinated by international politics. And actually, I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in South Dakota.
Nice.
But I developed, actually, believe it or not, a fascination with eschatology. My views around that have shifted since then. But that's really what drew me into an interest with the Middle East. And then I went on in college to study abroad. I really wanted to study in Israel, but my Christian college, which was Colorado Christian University, only had an opportunity in Egypt. So I went to Egypt, studied abroad there, came back home, worked in local news as a reporter and anchor back in my hometown in South Dakota for several years, but was continually drawn to international stories. I just didn't feel called to local news. So when my husband and I moved to Texas, to Austin, I went back to school and got a master's in Middle Eastern Studies, and then kind of worked my way into World Magazine. And actually, the first story I wrote was in 2005 and was the Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. Wow. And so that was just, I guess I appreciated the opportunity to be able to cover international news, but also from a Christian perspective. And so that's where I kind of felt like, hey, this is what God's called me to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so that kind of leads into maybe the first question that I would have, and I didn't write this down, but I'm sure you have an answer for it. You just said, the coming to these huge geopolitical conversations with a Christian perspective. I guess for me, I'm 24. People listen to this podcast. Most of them are, 18 to 30-year-old Gen Zers or millennials. A lot of us are trying to figure out what does it actually mean to be a conservative Christian, and how do we play that out in our viewpoints on politics here in America and worldwide. What is that connection between your Christian faith and the way that you view geopolitical issues?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we try to keep in mind at World that some issues the Bible is really clear about. For example, abortion. That's something we're not going to present both sides of that issue. Right. And other issues the Bible's less clear about. For example, international trade deals. Maybe even how much aid should you send to Ukraine, right? I don't know that the Bible says how much should we aid other countries in their war efforts. So I keep that in mind as I'm reporting. But, I think also the importance of old school journalism and pavement pounding, where we go out and we report on the scene, we talk to people. We aren't just sitting in our comfortable little studios somewhere. I mean, that's the goal anyways. With international stories, it can be a little more difficult.
Right.
But we're trying to get the information on the ground from the people who are in the know and doing the best we can to order and organize that information and kind of make sense of it from there. And that requires often, particularly in these wars, a knowledge of history, religion, and even culture. But at the same time, keeping in mind that ultimately, as believers, we are to be people of hope, and our ultimate allegiance is to Christ. And so I often, try to ask, in addition to all of those questions and those deep dives, how is God at work in this country, in this time, in this particular war situation, and what is the church doing? Because I think sometimes you can see a different angle even in that, and you can see how God's at work in ways that sometimes are surprising and actually have been encouraging to me in my faith. So sometimes I'm blown away by some of the ways the church is at work, and it gives me a new angle and a new perspective, and I think a humility as well. Like, I'm always learning as I'm diving into these conflicts. So I try to remind myself that there's going to be some nuances that might be uncomfortable, and to be okay with being uncomfortable with those nuances, and to continually ask myself about what that hope is and what the hope is in that particular region.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good point. As an American, obviously, it's hard to think outside of America. I think we're just so closed in. A lot of Americans think that what's happening in America is just what's the most important thing happening in the world. And so, yeah, putting on a different lens and being like, actually, the church is at work all over the world. And in America, I think there's a lot of opinions and a lot of frustrations with how the church is working in America, especially from more conservative Christians. And it can become our whole world. You say, well, if the church is not doing well in America, then the church isn't doing well anywhere. And that's just not true. That hasn't been true historically, right? It's like, if it fails somewhere, it's growing in another place. And that's really helpful to put the different lens on and just say like step back from this viewpoint and look at the whole entire world and recognize that God's at play. He's doing things all over the place. That's helpful. It's very helpful. Sure. So, okay, let's get into the specifics here. And we're going to start with talking about the Ukraine-Russia war. And I don't know if there's many similarities between the Ukraine-Russia war and the Israel-Hamas-Palestine war. I'm not sure exactly how the histories of all these things go together. I would assume they're not similar in any way because they're totally different parts of the world. But before we even get into the deeper details of the Ukraine war, can you just kind of give a bit of a background to how this war got started and how it's proceeded over the last couple of years or since it started? And I wrote in there, please don't give a 500-year history of Russia like Putin did with Tucker Carlson. But could we start with that?
Absolutely. And stop me if you have questions, because, I'm going to try to give an overview and highlight some of the key points. But of course, this could take up a whole podcast alone, right? There's so many different aspects to this.
Absolutely.
But essentially, if you unwind to 2013, let's go back to 2013, because really the first invasion started in 2014. Sure. But in 2013, there was growing discontent in Ukraine, I think particularly among students, but then that spread not just from Kyiv, where kind of the central protests were taking place in Maidan in Independence Square there in the center of the city, which is a beautiful place, by the way. But then these protests spread across the country. And what they were really protesting was Putin's puppet, Viktor Yanukovych, president of Ukraine at the time, making decisions that benefited Russia rather than the country of Ukraine. And so he had abandoned like a free trade deal with the European Union in favor of some sort of multi-billion-dollar bailout by the Kremlin. I want to say it was to the tune of 10 or 15 billion, something like that. Wow. And that really upset Ukrainians, not because it was just a negative, a decision that negatively impacted Ukraine, but because they saw this happening across the country where the Kremlin had infiltrated. I mean, really, it was the remnants of the old Soviet era still pulling the strings in Ukraine and not granting Ukraine the independence that they sought and desired. So you had these protests break out. in Ukraine. And Viktor Yanukovych kind of struck back at these protesters and passed laws saying, you're no longer allowed to have peaceful protests in Ukraine. They had set up barricades, they had, set up tents. And in kind of the altercations between these two groups, troops loyal to the president shot and killed some of these protesters. I think like 3 were killed initially, but then eventually there were more than 100 who were killed and thousands who were injured in those protests. And so negotiations were taking place. Eventually Yanukovych flees to Russia. And just when, you think kind of maybe things are going to simmer down, Russia invades the Crimean Peninsula and then eventually begins sending troops to the eastern Donbass region. And initially denies it. So that's where the phrase the Ukrainians coined, "little green men," came from, right? No, we don't have any troops there, or we aren't backing any Russian separatists there. Meanwhile, there are reports of mourning women whose sons and husbands are coming home in body bags from eastern Ukraine. Wow. So that conflict began 2013, 2014. And then, kind of simmered down, but there was still a lot happening. That eastern Donbass region was still occupied by Russia. There was an illegal referendum, contrary to what Vivek Ramaswamy said during the debate about that region being annexed and being part of Russia. It was not. That was only acknowledged by like 2 rogue countries. I think it was North Korea and Syria.
Well, can I ask? Okay, so that initial, what do you call that? What's the name of that? Would it be an invasion?
First invasion, yeah, Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Okay, so that was the first Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, I would have been like 13 years old, so I probably had no clue what was happening at that point. But that's the first Russian invasion, and so this war, I guess, that just in a way, kind of opened up even how I've think about the timeline of this war, because obviously my only understanding was that this war started in the last couple of years, but it seems like the conflict has been there for a long time. I've heard, and you can tell me if this is true or not, that there are groups of people, groups of Ukrainians on the eastern border who have been in favor for a long time of either the eastern part of Ukraine rejoining Russia, or are just in favor of a full-on I guess, joining of Russia. Is that true at all? Is there any truth to that?
There is some truth to that. There are people who have an affinity to Russia, but the numbers are quite small. So there was a Pew poll back in 2014 that in that eastern Donbass region, so right about when that illegal annexation took place. And the results of that poll were that about 70% of the people in that region were against becoming part of Russia, and only 18% were for it.
Wow. Okay. So that's clarifying. Yeah. I guess the only thing that I heard was like, there's a big, and this has been one of the arguments that I've heard from kind of the isolationist right at certain points is, well, some of the people over there, they actually just, people on the eastern end of Ukraine, they just want to be part of Russia. So just like let them do their own thing and we don't need to be involved in it. And not a super popular argument, but it seems like that's not even really rooted in overwhelming fact or overwhelming majority.
Yeah, and that one actually comes directly from the Kremlin's playbook, right?
Oh, really?
I mean, that one is like, we have this oppressed Russian population in Ukraine, and we need to go rescue them. And it's a line that's really worked well with Russians, right? Convincing them that this is justified, this so-called special operation, right? Remember at the beginning, you were not allowed to use the word war as a Russian, or you could be put in prison, and thousands were, because they were holding signs that were, protesting the war. But that is definitely one of the pretexts that Putin has used, as well as the Russian language, right? These are Russian language speakers. Well, I mean, come on, like lots of people speak Russian in Ukraine, and a lot of people speak Ukrainian, and there's really a lot of similarities between the two languages, right? There's a lot of crossover there. But language has never been a pretext for war, right? Just
Right.
because there's plenty of people who speak Russian. Like I have a friend who is ethnically Russian, but Ukrainian nationality.
Mm.
Um, Russian is his birth language, but he's completely 100% loyal to Ukraine. He actually is from Gorlovka in the eastern Donbass region, and fled during that first invasion, left his newly remodeled apartment vacant, hasn't been back since.
Wow.
Hasn't been able to go back since.
Right.
His father still lives there. But, there's a lot of stories like that are not, it's not clear cut, right? It's not like
Yeah.
just because you speak Russian means that you are loyal to Russia.
Yeah. Language isn't indicative of belief. I mean, it's not indicative of what you actually want to happen. So that makes total sense. Okay, so continue in this timeline. I think we're in 2013, 2014, right? Kind of that initial invasion.
Yeah, so I'm glad you pointed out that a lot of people aren't familiar with that first invasion, that first war. I mean, there were like 10,000, I believe it was like 10,000 civilians who died.
Wow.
Right. So this goes way back, and there were quite a few casualties, particularly in the East, as they were taking over. There were a lot of churches that were actually taken over as well, Protestant churches and churches that were not Russian Orthodox.
Mm-hmm.
And then during that occupation, Russian troops also did kind of set up camp in a lot of the Russian Orthodox churches.
Sure.
Many of those priests were former KGB agents during Soviet times. So there's been somewhat of an affinity there to the Kremlin's agenda. And there's much more that we could say about that. We can talk about religion too at some point as well, because I think that's important to address, because folks like Tucker Carlson have said, Zelensky is persecuting Christians. And that's not true. It's actually the Russian separatists who have come in, or the Russian troops now who have come in and are persecuting Christians who are members of Protestant and Catholic churches. Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was going to continue with the timeline, but do you have another question specifically about that? Because that is a whole.
Yeah, I don't want to derail us, but I do wonder. Because that's something that I've heard, is that that there's persecution from Zelensky on Christians. Is this persecution? Is this perceived persecution on Christians a persecution of the Russian Orthodox churches, like infiltration in particular areas in Ukraine? I've heard that as well. It's hard to keep all these things in line. Is it the Russian Orthodox, which I don't know anything about Russian Orthodox Christianity and what they believe in, but it's highly connected to the Russian government. And so if you have Russian Orthodox churches in Ukraine, there's a chance that they're in some ways connected to the government, right? And so maybe if there's persecution on the Russian churches in Ukraine, it can be perceived outwardly as, oh, that's just governmental persecution, rather than the government maybe engaging in trying to keep certain government people or connections to Russia out. Does that make sense? Is that what's happening in any way?
Well, that is exactly what's happening. Okay. And I wish the people who are popularizing that perspective would do a little bit more digging and actually explain what's happening there, because there's a couple different things. First of all, if you look at the Russian Orthodox Church, right? So to be more specific, it's the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. So it's the branch of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Right.
And yes, they have been accused of, there's actually been evidence of them promoting Kremlin propaganda, hosting troops in their church, and really colluding with the Kremlin. And so that, we might look at that and say, well, that's not really justification. But if you look at, how we've handled Chinese infiltration of institutions here in the United States, like we've shut down Confucius institutes, we shut down a Chinese embassy for propaganda reasons, right? They're promoting, they're really engaging in information laundering. And so that's a big part of what Ukraine was trying to put an end to when they said, we're going to be doing some investigations into these churches, these particular churches that are kind of aligning themselves with Moscow.
Sure.
As far as I know, I haven't heard of them rounding up priests, putting them in prison or anything like that. But you have to remember, Ukraine is under martial law. So that's why they're not holding elections. right? And that's just part of their constitution. That was another accusation leveled at Ukraine, right? Like, why aren't you holding your presidential elections? I don't think that's an unusual thing. But going back to the religious persecution, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate is connected to the Kremlin. Back in 2018, I think, or 2019, the president of Ukraine went to the head of the Orthodox Church in Constantinople, I think it's Bartholomew, and requested a tomos, right? Like basically granting them granting authenticity to the Orthodox Church. So there was a Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine that wasn't considered an official member of the global Orthodox Church. They were just kind of meeting on their own. And so interestingly, the Kremlin had a hard time with this, right? And leveled some threats and accusations at Bartholomew and said, don't you dare grant them an autocephalous, which, why would he do that? What does he care? Well, it's a means of control in Ukraine, a means of influence in Ukraine, and money, right? Land, property, churches, money, all of that. Well, Bartholomew granted the autocephalous to it's kind of flipped. It's like the Orthodox Church of Ukraine of the Kiev Patriarchate.
Gotcha.
So now if you are Orthodox believer in Ukraine, you can go to that church and feel like you're part of the official church. And so I believe that there's now only a very small percentage of people who attend the Moscow Patriarchate, especially since 2014, well, actually the autocephalous was 2019, but I think it's just ever since that was granted, more and more people have drifted away from the Moscow Patriarchate.
Because they don't want to be in connection with the Russian government, basically. They're just not in cahoots with that.
Exactly. And Ukrainians are deeply disturbed and upset by what has happened. And even the Christians I know are upset at their Christian brothers and sisters in Russia, many of whom they've had longstanding relationships with, but drifted apart from since this all happened. And I think particularly since 2022, when things became much more obvious and direct and deadly, really. I mean, it was deadly in 2014, but that's just now, with the bombing of Kyiv and maternity hospitals and war crimes across the country. I think Ukrainians are increasingly looking for ways to cut ties to Moscow, and that involves church ties. It involves more and more Russians or more and more Ukrainians speaking the Ukrainian language and abandoning the Russian language, even those in parts of the country which is the East, where Russian is spoken and more widespread. And so they're just, increasingly looking for ways to cut those ties.
Right. Okay, so let's continue that timeline, because I want to know how we got to, how we got to the modern invasion, because I guess that would have been the previous invasion. So continue that timeline, and then we'll get up to kind of where we are today.
Yeah, so things had kind of cooled down then between 2014 and 2022, right? You still had Russian control of that region, Russian control of both the Eastern Donbass region and Crimea. And, there'd be kind of exchange of fire back and forth, still troops serving on the front lines. And then you fast forward to February of 2022, and actually the United States began, and this is probably where people are a little more familiar with, what happened. But the United States began warning Ukraine that, hey, we're seeing massive buildup of troops. And the people I talked to in the country were a little bit in disbelief, like, really? Is there going to be another invasion, like a second run at this? And so I think it was the 24th of February, where, a couple people I was in contact with were on the front lines getting ready to deliver supplies to some of the Ukrainian troops there serving in and near Donetsk. When they heard missiles being fired and, Russian troops began crossing over to Ukraine, and we kind of have this kind of next level attack on Ukraine. and its sovereignty. And this is where, we had troops trying to reach the capital, and Ukrainians really just showing us what they were made of, and their grit and determination in this, their willingness to fight, to die for their country. And I think this is where a lot of Russians were surprised. So I began hearing about, the information and the propaganda that the Kremlin was spreading about how this was a special operation to free Ukraine from Nazis and this awful, evil, horrible Western influence.
Yeah.
And sadly, a lot of Russians, I think, bought those lines. Like, you'd hear about daughters in Ukraine calling their mothers in Russia, and the mothers saying, like, hey, isn't it like, are your troops welcoming our troops? Like, are your people welcoming our troops as they're freeing you from this Nazi control? And like, a lot of soldiers expected parades in the city, and they were shocked that no, instead it's like Ukrainians want you out. There's like grandmothers standing in front of tanks saying, you can't pass. Like, this is our country. So, we really kind of saw the level of determination that Ukrainians have to repel Moscow's invasion and the Kremlin's control of their country.
Well, what was it that pushed Putin and Russia to actually invade this time? It couldn't have been just like arbitrary, like, oh yeah, today we're just going to go and do this. So what actually pushed them over the edge? Over, you said, like, about an 8-year period of things kind of simmering down, not much happening, and then it did seem like, to me, out of nowhere, Russia now is invading Ukraine. Do you know what pushed them over the edge and why they did that?
It seems to me that perhaps one factor in that decision is that they were just waiting and looking for an opportunity.
Sure.
And I think that, when you have a strong foreign policy and when America is projecting strength abroad, it does keep bad things from happening. And when the United States is projecting weakness and trying to pursue maybe ridiculous things like the JCPOA, right? Like the Iran nuclear agreement, things like that maybe could be perceived as weaker. I think that's when, tyrants like Putin say, hey, I might have a window of opportunity here to finish what I started. So I don't know if there was never any sort of peace agreement. There was never any sort of, there was never any resolution to that war. I think it was just kind of put on hold so that Putin, my take is maybe perhaps once Trump and his unpredictability was no longer in office, that Putin saw a window of opportunity there with the Biden administration and just thought he'd cross over. And, to be fair, Biden administration did come right in with aid to Ukraine, perhaps not enough, quickly enough, right? It's been just enough to keep, the Ukrainians in the game. I think we could have managed that a lot better from the get-go and prevented this and ended this thing more, in a quicker, more expedient way. At least that's what I'm hearing from the people who are in the know, who study these things and really do the very deep dives into the numbers and, military capability and our defense industrial base and all of those things. But that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what I was going to ask next is we've heard this a million times, is that, well, if Trump was in office, what happened in Ukraine would have never have happened. And I've wondered if that's legitimate or not. And it does seem to me like if you kind of have a weaker philosophy surrounding foreign affairs, which oftentimes the Democrat philosophy, I know Obama's philosophy was, if you just give the bad people what they want, they'll stop doing bad things, which that doesn't really make any sense. If you give the bully your lunch every single day, he's not going to stop asking for your lunch, right? So, So you really think that it was just Trump getting out of office and Putin saying, like, hey, well, this is the opportunity. Obviously, Joe Biden's not going to do much about it or won't be as unpredictable as Donald Trump. That's what you think happened. I agree with that, but
I mean, look, I'm not supporting all of Trump's agendas or foreign. I mean, there's a lot we could pick apart with his foreign policy, but I do think the unpredictability factor weighs in, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I do think some of these tyrants look, and they look at Trump and they're like, we don't really know what
Right.
he is, just crazy enough that like
Mm-hmm.
he might do something crazy. So
Mm-hmm.
I do kind of think that I don't think it's a coincidence that you
Yeah.
had Obama during the 2014 invasion, and then you had Trump during kind of a little bit of a stalemate.
Yeah.
Russia's still in Ukraine. This is not resolved, but that it hadn't heated up again to this level. And then you
Mm-hmm.
have the Biden administration during the 2022
Mm-hmm.
second invasion of Ukraine.
Well, okay, that's interesting that you say that, because I might botch this story a little bit, but Ben Shapiro was talking about how he was at some sort of fundraising event and Donald Trump was there and they were discussing this exact issue. And Shapiro was kind of asking him about Putin invading Ukraine and if there were any conversations, I think, prior to the Biden administration between Trump and Putin about this very issue. And it's kind of funny, but it's like basically Trump told Putin, if you invade, like we're gonna bomb the crap out of you. And Putin said, no, you won't. And Trump looked at Putin and said, but I might. And that's exactly the kind of rhetoric, right? Like actually he might, you never know with Trump, which is like assuring for somebody in America or even for the rest of the free world to say, you have somebody who's willing, who the opposition sees as potentially willing to go all out if need be. Whereas I think that it has been historically proven that the Democrats, they most likely won't go out. They might talk. They're kind of all bark, no bite to say, they'll talk a little bit about how they're going to do something, but if you cross this line, we're going to do something. But then when you cross the line, they don't do anything. And so their actions have said more than what their words have said. So.
But the flip side of that, though, is
Sure.
that we have seen this isolationism creep into the Republican Party, where I'm just like wondering what happened to the party of Reagan. And so, like JD Vance's comments about like no more, I think, didn't he say no more aid to Ukraine? Like, I think
he might have. I
think
can't
his
remember.
Perspective is more isolationist. And, and I know Trump has said, right, like if he is elected, then he will come in and put an end to this war. I don't know exactly how he's going to do that. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be complicated. But I think he did at some point tell Fox that he would dramatically increase aid to Ukraine. Right. And so I think there's a case to be made for that. And I think, that's a wider discussion. And I'm going to get some more angry emails about this, but because, this is like a very hot button topic for people. But I do see also this creeping isolationism in the Republican Party that has also concerned me. And I know recent polls that I'm trying to remember. I was listening to a podcast, and there are some recent polls showing it's not as widespread as you think among Republicans. We're just seeing kind of how it's playing out, like in the House of Representatives and these efforts to kind of overturn more aid to Ukraine. And they didn't pass, right? Like, we approved the recent package of what, 60 billion.
Yeah, it was a lot. Yeah.
But that's another, discussion point as well.
Well, and I think some of the bigger names in conservative media, obviously Tucker Carlson, and I think Candace Owens is now in the semi isolationist perspective. Even she's gone as far as in certain ways to be pro-Palestine, and that's wild to me. And then Matt Walsh is more, he's definitely more isolationist as well. And so, I don't know. I think it has something to do with the fact, and I've thought a little bit about this because it's very bizarre to me. I guess the way that I look at it is like, if the United States is supposed to be this kind of beacon of freedom to the entire world, which was kind of how we emerged out of World War II, then it would seem like having it from a Christian perspective. I think the isolationist view assumes a false view of human nature, a false anthropology, or an indifferent anthropology, and saying, well, if we just let people kind of just do whatever they want, if we don't get involved, everything will be fine. Other countries, like, let them have their culture and stuff like that. But the issue is that if you don't have like a moral foundation, and in places like Russia, I don't think there's really a moral foundation. The arbitrary law and the arbitrary rule is based off of whatever Putin wants that day. It's just a very concentrated view of liberalism, right? Where you're just like, do whatever I want, whenever I want, however I want, but only only Putin can do that, and everybody has to align with what he wants to do. And so I think
Right.
Americans have lived in this kind of luxurious, we haven't had to deal with any real major issues in the United States. I mean, there's obviously things here and there, and 9/11 happened 20 some years ago, but we have gotten used to not having to deal with the horrors of human nature in front of our face. And so I think the perspective from a lot of conservatives and people in general are just like, well, I don't want to deal with what's happening out there, so let's just not even get involved in it. And I don't think they recognize that that sort of ideology could potentially get millions of people killed. And that's
Yeah.
very selfish ideology, especially if you believe that the ideals that the United States claims to or historically have upheld are true and objectively good. You would want to, in some capacity, spread those as much as you possibly can. Now, I know that there's, I don't know if you know Jeffrey Sachs. He was on Tucker Carlson, and this is where it gets so difficult for me, because some of these people who have been high up in these in the CIA and things like that, and they've been high up in some of these huge foreign affair issues, have talked about the immorality that the United States kind of imposes on other countries. So it's hard for people to actually know what's true. But generally speaking, I think that the isolationist perspective comes from a kind of a false understanding of human nature, because we've just been confined to luxury for 20 plus years, my generation especially. I know that's a long answer. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, and I think to piggyback on that, like, we live in the North American continent with relatively friendly neighbors. Sure, we have a southern border crisis, but
Right.
we're not threatened by our neighbors.
Right.
And I love, like, Senator John Thune from South Dakota met with Netanyahu shortly after the October 7th attacks. And,
Wow.
Interesting exchange that I think is a helpful way to think about it. He was pointing out to Netanyahu that October 7th was kind of like our 9/11, right? Like, this was a devastating moment for the country.
Mm-hmm.
And Netanyahu said to him, yes, except your enemy was 1,000 miles away. Right. Like, ours is right next door.
Wow. Yeah.
And so I do think we kind of live in, a little bit of an island on our own, and think that, hey, we can just pull up the drawbridges and just the world will take care of itself.
Right.
And that was kind of, a pretty common way to look at the world back prior to World War II, until the bombing of Pearl Harbor, right? Like, we were out, we were not getting involved in World War II. Like, hey, we'll send, eventually we determined that we would send Great Britain some weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And that ramped up our defense industrial base at the time, which was, kind of atrophied, which is what's happening now, right?
Yeah.
With Ukraine. But it took, attack on Pearl Harbor and more than 2,000 American soldiers dying to draw us into that war. And I do think you can look at the situation now in the world, and you can look around and you can say, there is kind of a new alliance of bad actors, right? Iran, Russia, China, North Korea. And, as Defense Secretary Bob Gates said at one point, like, our holiday from history is over, right? Like, it is time that we began taking seriously these threats and the impact they could potentially have in the United States of America. And I don't think Putin will stop at Ukraine, right? Like, he in fact, he invaded Georgia in, I think it was 2008. And more recently has threatened to annex like 20% of their territory in Georgia. So you kind of see, like, a repeat story there. Now, Georgia is a non-NATO member, but I believe they've applied for NATO membership. But if he were to continue on to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, any of these NATO members, right, then we have an Article 5 obligation to defend those territories. And then it's American, men and women serving on the front lines, not the Ukrainians, right, who are there really fighting this war for us and trying to turn back Putin's attempts to overturn really American global dominance is part of what he's after. He's kind of got his own narrative, and really, it's, I think, an attempt on his part to upend the democratic order in Europe.
Right.
So I really don't think it's something that's just all about Ukraine for him. I think he's got his sights set on bigger prizes.
It's really just a question of who's going to upend the democratic order in Europe. Was it going to be Russia or is it going to be Europe itself? Because they've gone
Right.
completely and totally progressive. But to your
True.
point about 9/11, the enemies of 9/11 being thousands of miles away, right? That's a great point, because if Mexico or Canada had 200 nuclear weapons and they were like not in that, they were not happy with the United States, all of these same people would be like, we need help. We got to do something about, like, people would be crazy in America. But we've had the luxury of living between two. I mean, Mexico is like a non-factor in a lot of ways, other than the border and keeping the border controlled. And Canada has I don't know. I don't even know what's happening in Canada. Nobody really cares what's happening in Canada in a lot of ways. But if you have somebody next to you that's a world superpower with the most nuclear weapons in the entire world, which I think Russia has more than the United States, then, and whose leader believes that your entire country belongs to him, yeah, I think there's reason for fear. Now, you mentioned NATO, and I want to talk about NATO because I don't know enough about the situation with NATO and Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And so first, I think that there's actually a lot of young people who don't even really know what NATO is and what the purpose is of NATO, and because we're young and we haven't been taught anything. So can you first explain what NATO is and what its goal and purpose is as an organization?
Yes, I'm writing a note too, because I want to circle back to the benefits of Ukraine aid and how that's actually good for our military readiness, because I think that's something people really don't understand. But NATO is basically a security alliance that it's a group of partners who have agreed to collectively support one another's right to exist, right to have their own sovereign borders and boundaries. And it was created in part to manage and deal with Russian encroachment, right? I mean, that was part of its original founding purpose. And so you have, what is it? Is it like 30 some countries who are now members? More recently, we added Finland and Sweden, I believe, both historically neutral, like we're not getting involved. Is that right? Did you verify that?
Currently 32 current members of NATO. Yeah.
32. Yeah. And so, as you know, there's requirements to get into NATO. It's not just like, hey, sign on this form. Like you got to jump through a bunch of hoops to get in. And so we saw, in the wake of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Baltic countries really scrambling and desperately wanting to get into NATO. Why? Because Russia invades its neighbors, right? And they wanted that security assurance that they would be backed up, that somebody would come to their aid and their assistance should Russia decide to invade one of its neighbors. So that's kind of the reason behind NATO. One of the requirements, this is one of the criticisms, so one of the requirements is that to be a NATO member, you need to be spending 2% of your GDP on military defense. And some countries haven't been pulling their weight. And so that's been one of the criticisms, is why is the United States the one that's really kind of running the show and everybody's depending on the United States, and a lot of these European countries are just kind of getting a free ride in a sense. But my understanding is that, there's a couple reasons for the number of countries who are meeting that ceiling increasing. One of them is that Trump, when he took office, did put pressure on them. And again, I'm not trying to give a list of reasons to vote for Trump. I'm just saying, I'm just saying, that is one thing in his foreign policy that I think was helpful, was that he came in and did put the full court press on these countries, saying, hey, you gotta at least, I think he actually was asking for 4%, which is a little high. He was like really pushing these countries to up their defense spending. But I think it in part worked, but I think it's also Russian threats have also pushed some of these countries to increase their defense spending. Like Estonia has always met more than Estonia knows, like, we're on it. We want to be military ready. So, unlike some of the countries in Europe, these Baltics, like, they know what it's like and they know they need to be military ready.
Right.
But I think since 2014, more and more countries are reaching 3% of GDP, 4%. And actually, a lot of them are sending quite a bit of Ukraine aid. In fact, these countries, I know we think we're carrying all the burden. We are sending the most to Ukraine.
Yeah.
But as a percentage, how do we measure it? As a percentage of their GDP, the Baltics and Norway are sending more money to Ukraine than we are. I think we're like number 15.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, but what do you think about that though? Because I'm torn on that, because I think that's a good point to make, that not everybody nobody has the money that the United States has. So it's always going to look like we're doing more than everybody else, but you have to look at it based on the percentages in relationship to the fuller amount of money that each country has to put towards anything. So I understand that point. So do you think that we're giving the right? I mean, this is just like you can't really have a perfect answer to this. Like you said, you don't open the Bible and say, oh yeah, give like 8% to Ukraine in 2024. But are we giving too much? Because my initial reaction to a lot, like the $60 billion Ukraine aid that we just passed, was, I really hope that the countries in Europe who are geographically close to this war are giving more than that, at least combined, if not individual countries giving very close to that on their own. So first question is, do you think it's too much money? Second question is, are the countries in and close around this conflict giving proportionally?
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you asked, because now I can circle back to the the question I wanted to address before. Yeah, I mean, should we be cutting some of our spending? Absolutely. Is this what we should cut? I don't think so. And here's one of the major reasons why, is that we do have an atrophied industrial defense industry, right? Like we have not been on wartime footing. And a lot of what we're sending to Ukraine are weapon systems that have been sitting on the shelves for many years. And so in essence, we're getting rid of the old stuff and we're replacing it with new stuff. And so according to the American Enterprise Institute, which has done some great research on this, like if you look up Mackenzie Eaglin, she has visited a number of these weapons factories across our country. Like some 70% of our aid to Ukraine stays right here in the United States. And there's even maps on their website that show exactly which states these are going to. And it's really replacing some of the old weapons that we have with new ones. We're hiring specialized workers to once again to kind of fill in these gaps. And we're really getting things up and running. We're modernizing our weapons as a result of sending kind of these older weapons to Ukraine. We're getting some of them tested on the battlefields in Ukraine. Right. So in many ways that this Ukraine aid is benefiting us and benefiting our military readiness. So I think that's an important thing to consider. And I think it's something not many people know.
Well, it feels like that's a little bit of a backlash for Russia. If I was Russia, I'd be like, we're trying to invade and to take over Ukraine, but now we're helping the rest of the world make more advancements on their military weaponry. And so, which would discourage him from moving anywhere further west, which is beneficial for the rest of the world. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And really, we need to be spending more than what we're spending GDP for defense, right? Yeah. Like it's dipped dramatically. And, during the Cold War, what was it, up like in the 4% of GDP, somewhere around there, maybe higher. Sure. So we're below and it's dipping even further. We need to be spending more on defense. And so I think this is one step in the right direction. China is spending, it's not billions. It's like, I want to say some like Mackenzie Eaglin, I think I said at one point it was close to $1 trillion. On defense, on military spending. They have the largest Navy, largest Army, right? Like they're a growing military presence across the Pacific and even around the world and into Africa, which is where, Russia has a presence in Africa in 13 countries as well. Like we need to get in the game. Like we are falling behind significantly. And I think us having to think critically about aiding Ukraine and what that looks like and modernizing our military is one step in the right direction. Is it a lot of money? Yes. I think it's like 175 billion. Is it way more than anybody else? It is. Can we afford it? I think we can if, there's probably some cuts we need to make on some things that don't make sense to spend money on. And that's not my field of expertise. But I do think that it is money well spent, especially if you consider the fact that the majority of it's staying here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the other countries closer to Ukraine are then giving proportionally enough money, I guess, in relationship to what we're giving? Are they giving enough money themselves?
A lot of them are. I think the ones who cared the most are. I think Europe's doing better, and I don't have the statistics on the European NATO members. I think they were getting, an F for a while, maybe a D. And I'm sure there's still plenty of room for improvement, and I hope that we continue to put pressure on them to continue to arm and supply Ukraine. I think they're doing better, but I know like Poland is sending quite a bit, Romania, all the Baltics, Norway. So I don't have the statistics on each and every country, but from what I understand, they're spending more. A lot of those countries are spending more as a percentage of their GDP than we are.
Mm-hmm. Now, is it true that Ukraine has wanted to join NATO? NATO hasn't allowed Ukraine to join for a long time, and now I might botch this timeline, but I think that was it Biden or somebody within the last couple of years, I guess, has made comments about allowing Ukraine to join NATO before the war. And maybe it wasn't Biden. Obviously, I don't think it would be Biden if it was before the war. But before the war, people in NATO were considering allowing Ukraine to join, which potentially pushed Putin over the edge as well, because he didn't want NATO to be that close to his borders. Is there any legitimacy to that? Do you think that you tell me what you think about that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, I think it's important to go back and kind of look at that timeline, particularly back in 2014. So my understanding is that back in 2014, there was no real concerted effort on the part of the Ukrainians to join NATO. It wasn't something that was on the table. The protesters were really pushing for Ukraine to join the European Union, not NATO. NATO was officially a neutral country at that point. And then it was only after Russia invaded in 2014, right? So remember, it was like February 2014. It was in the fall that Ukraine began inquiring about joining NATO. Why? Because they just got invaded by Russia. Right. So, yeah, I've heard that argument several times, like, Russia's afraid of NATO encroachment. Well, why? Why isn't Russia? Because we're going to go invade Russian land? No, because Russia wants to invade its neighbors. They don't want us near. They don't want NATO near. They don't want NATO adding members, because then it's fewer of these former Soviet republics that Russia can invade.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, it is interesting, because you wonder what the ideology is there, what the thought process is that leads somebody to believe that if you move NATO east, if they kind of bump up on the border, if NATO bumps up on the border of Russia, generally speaking, I think most people would think that was just for the sake of protection, or for the sake of an alliance to kind of show Russia, like, hey, you've got your land, but don't you dare move this way. But it seems like these isolationists, or these people on the right, on the conservative side in the United States, who see that NATO is moving east, have made the assumption that they're going to continue to just move east, and Russia is reacting out of defense of its own interest. Is there any legitimacy to that at all? I know you kind of just said NATO's not moving into Russia, but is there any legitimacy to some sort of perception from Putin and Russia to say, hey, we have a responsibility to defend our own interest, and if we see NATO move into allowing Ukraine to be a part of NATO, this seems to us like a a problem. It seems like moving towards an invasion or something like that. So I guess, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think there's any credibility in that at all, because what's missing from that argument is the wishes of the Ukrainian people,
Okay.
right, and the Georgian people, right,
Mhm.
and it only takes into consideration what the Kremlin wants, and what others are willing to do for Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, all of those countries.
Mhm.
And so, really, NATO membership has always been up to countries who want to apply. Right?
Right.
They have a choice. Right? It's not like people are going out pursuing them. Like, it's their choice to make an appeal to join
Sure.
NATO. And so, yeah, I don't think so. I think that's the Kremlin would like people to think that, right?
Mhm.
I think they would like people to think that they're feeling threatened by NATO's presence on their borders. But really, it's the opposite. NATO is the whole reason, or the whole reason for NATO is because of Russian encroachment, right? And that's why you have countries like Finland, which shares like an 800-mile border with Russia, deciding, right, in the wake of all of this, to join NATO, because suddenly, they're biting their nails, and there's Russian submarines showing up off the coast of Stockholm, Sweden, and right, Russian
Mhm.
encroachment in the Arctic, and so you're kind of seeing, even the neutral countries beginning to get nervous about Russia's plans, not the
Mhm.
reverse. And I think, it's important to go back to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum,
Mhm.
where, we've actually throughout history made an attempt to appease and put to ease the mind of Russian leaders. So
Mhm.
1994 Budapest Memorandum, we gave security assurances, we being the
Mhm.
United States, Britain, and Russia, we gave
Mhm.
security assurances to Ukraine in exchange for them giving up their nuclear weapons.
Oh,
I
interesting.
find that astounding, right? Like,
Yeah.
you have to wonder, like, if Ukraine still had their nuclear weapons, would all of this happen? And what good did it do
Yeah.
Ukraine? It
Right.
did them no good
Mm.
whatsoever. Other than perhaps maybe that has been one reason why we've supplied aid to Ukraine. Like,
Sure.
maybe we feel some obligation to do so. I'm not sure.
Right.
And then we also at
But if the
one
nuclear
point,
weapons would have prevented it in the beginning, they wouldn't have needed our support. So yeah,
right?
that
Yeah,
point makes
good
sense.
point.
Yeah.
Good point. Yeah, fair point. But and then there was also a time where we dismantled plans to install ballistic missiles in, I think it was Czech Republic and Poland,
Mm.
right? Like, Russia was like, yeah, no, we don't like that. And so
Mhm.
we agreed not to put those ballistic missiles in those countries.
Mhm.
So I think we have attempted to appease and meet the demands of Moscow at different points along the
Sure.
timeline, and I don't know that any of those things have really helped
Mhm.
create regional stability.
Well, right, and that perspective of NATO moving east and Russia acting in its own interest. I think it assumes, kind of like you said, it assumes that the Ukrainian people want to be a part of Russia. It kind of assumes in a lot of ways that their desire, that the interest of the Ukrainian people, not this puppet government that they say that Ukraine has, but the people just want to be a part of Russia. So just let Russia do whatever they want, which is ridiculous. Yeah, I don't. How did we get to that place? How do these people get to that place? I know that we talked about it a little bit, but how do you get to the place where you're incredibly sympathetic towards dictators like Putin? My whole life,
Hmm.
China, Russia, Kim Jong-un. I mean, these people were all psychopaths, and the United States, and generally speaking in the United States, everybody thought these people were nuts. Communism's bad. I obviously think this is a larger question because I think it goes into the public school system and how things are being taught ideologically about politics and morals and things like that. But you wouldn't expect it to make its way into what would have been a lot of these people talking like this are mainstream conservative commentators, and now they're sympathetic towards communism in certain ways, and they feel bad. They feel bad for Russia. How is that happening? I don't even understand. Is it because of COVID? Is it because they just don't trust the government at all? I mean, that could be a part of it, but do
That
you have
might be
any
part
idea?
of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a couple things at play. I mean, number one is what you're saying, right? Like, there's we kind of have these polarized views now and
Yeah, right.
opinions. And so we look for information that we think can prop up our polarized view,
Yeah.
right? Even if it's like part of the story.
Hmm.
And then, you put a little spin on it, or it's just shallow information, or it's just something grabbed off the internet.
Hmm.
And then, and this is just what drives me crazy too, is right. It lacks depth. It lacks
Right.
serious old school journalism reporting. And people just grab onto it as if it's truth because it fits their political perspective. So that's number one.
Mm.
No, and of course, right, what you mentioned about what's being taught in the public schools. And I
Right.
think that is, you're more talking about the left there, right? Like how
Sure.
the
Right.
left
Right.
might create, an alliance or have some sympathetic views towards the Kremlin.
Well,
But
I want to
yeah,
make a little bit of a clarification. Is I do think that a lot of these commentators, and I'm not as much. Tucker's a weird one, and so I'll stay away from him. And I think Walsh is generally speaking more conservative, but I think people like Candace Owens and that realm of quote unquote conservatism, which I don't think it is conservatism. I think that they're operating out of a liberal ideology and that their main goal in life is to preserve themselves and really they don't care about anybody else, and so they start to compromise, which is exactly what the Republican Party is doing right now on abortion, to kind of abstract. I mean, Trump's whole answer during the presidential debate on the reason why people should be able to use abortion pills is because they should quote unquote follow their heart. Makes absolutely no sense. There's no objective basis to that sort of claim, and following your heart on whether or not you should murder somebody isn't, I guess that's not really a good compass. It's not going to lead you in the right direction. And it's a false understanding of human nature. It's the idea that people are generally good. And if you stay out of my business, I'll stay out of your business. Historically, that's just not been true. And in wars, that's obviously not true, right? Russia's not staying out of other people's business. And so now there's a conflict and there's responsibilities. So I don't know. Maybe that's helpful to clarify, but I think that a lot of these conservatives, while telling everybody, hey, I'm a conservative, I'm a Christian, they're actually just operating out of a liberal, non-Christian ethic that I think they've subconsciously picked up on in the general culture, and they don't even know that they're operating out of it. That's just a theory, but I think that that's probably what's happening. Anyways, do you have any thoughts on that? And then,
yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true. And I think in addition to that, there is, and this has been sad to see, there's a tendency among some Christians and some conservatives to see Putin as a protector of family values and,
right.
the only hope that we have to counter,
Mm-hmm.
the leftist LGBTQ anti-family agenda of the left. And I did a story on this a while ago. There was like a Christian organization that was going to host some sort of pro-family forum in Russia.
Yeah.
And there were people connected to the Kremlin coming. And this was after the first invasion of Ukraine. So this was sometime after 2014.
Wow.
And, actually, it might have been 2014 or 2015 because there were several who backed out. Like I think Focus on the Family backed out.
Oh.
And, I've seen this tendency to want to defend Putin because he props up so-called family values. But I mean, you talk to Christians in Russia and they're like, this is nuts. Like he kills journalists, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is not a safe place to be a journalist. Like Anna Politkovskaya, 2006, political opponents like Sergei Skripal poisoned on British soil, or Alexei Navalny more recently, right? Another political opponent.
Sure.
It's a kleptocracy. It is not a safe place for a lot of churches, people who oppose the war. You have this mass exodus of Russians after the war. So sadly, I think you do see a tendency among some conservatives to want to say, hey, at least they're doing this right. But they're turning a blind eye to everything else that the Kremlin is promoting that is very anti-Christian.
Right. And it's probably not true that Putin is pro-family if he's willing to murder
Right.
people, right? So there's a disconnect in that sort of logic where you're going to say, yes, I'm pro the fundamental institution of marriage and family, but I'm not pro the fundamental belief that human beings have dignity. So that's going to fall apart at some level. You actually aren't pro either. You're not pro dignity. You're also not pro family. You're just pro, I guess, and that you would just be pro making sure to maintain all of the. Well, maybe it has something to do with Putin feeling like he can maintain a certain level of control if he doesn't allow for people to kind of move outside what have been the historical social norms and to stay within historical social norms, even if those historical social norms like marriage between one man and one woman are good. They're not being done for the right, proper reasons. They're being done for the reason of being controlled by the government and to maintain a particular type of norm. Because if you started to see a bunch of trans people walking around Russia, people would be like, "What? This is out of the norm. This isn't in alignment with our traditional values. Is there something wrong top down?" And then they might begin to think that they could start to question the system. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud as we're talking. But
yeah, well, and I think Putin himself has also used the Russian Orthodox Church,
yeah, right.
right, himself to try to get Russians to really support his agenda and to see him as this good Christian king who, is fighting off the evils of the West. And, it's worked, right? Like people really, I mean, sadly, do see him as right, like this amazing Christian leader who is, protecting Mother Russia and keeping it from Western infiltration, and is the only hope for the world.
Yeah, right.
So it's sad to see that the power of that influence, and then just the Kremlin propaganda around that as well.
Yeah, it's also sad to see that these conservatives or these Republican commentators in the United States, they will be so unbelievably critical of our own government, which I think is fine in a lot of ways. But then they're just like, yeah, we totally believe everything coming out of the Russian government. You're like, wait, where is that coming from? Yeah. And I think it's this human desire to want to be a part of some sort of function, what they view as a sort of functioning government. I mean, I look to and not to be held accountable by not to be held accountable by God. So I'll make that. I'll connect that with the Israelites in the Old Testament wanting a king because the other countries had a king, and God saying like, "I'm your king," and they're like, "No, we want a human king." And it's like, well, that's the dumbest. It didn't work. It never worked. People can read through the Old Testament. It didn't work. It didn't work one time. Every single king, even the good ones, David and Solomon, and they had major moral failures. And I think that people want to grasp onto a governmental system that they feel is secure and bypass again what I think people should see when their government fails. It should be pointing them towards the fact that the human being is fallible, the human being is sinful, and we need to align ourselves with even a higher morality and a higher being, which is God, that can tell us what we ought to do and ought not to do. But that would force people to look internally at their own nature and to recognize that they're sinful people and they deserve to go to hell. And people don't want to recognize that. So they go, well, we like Putin, we found another secure, strong leader, and we're just going to kind of agree with that person. So yeah, that's really weird. It's not weird. It makes sense, but it's just sad. And I think it's indicative of a type of failed government in the United States as well. So there's a lot of blame to be shared,
Maybe that's why we need that reminder that our ultimate allegiance is to Christ, right? Like, not to say that there isn't an important aspect to the calling of government, right?
Absolutely,
and countries, right? I mean, I want to make that clear, right? I think it's at Romans 13 where we gain an understanding that God created the idea of governments, and there's good that can be done. Governments can be used to protect people. But as Christians, our ultimate allegiance is to Christ, right? Like in First Peter, like we're a holy nation, a royal priesthood. I like that notion of, I was talking to my pastor about this the other day, like we're a holy nation, a group of people who are united as a global church to serve our Lord and Savior, right? That's ultimately where we find our hope, not in our government, not in, a two-state solution for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or whatever it might be, right? Because some of these things, I mean, I'm just not sure we're ever going to see on this side of heaven a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And that's important. I think it's important for all these sorts of governmental conversations, because I think people can feel like, well, okay, we can talk about geopolitics all day, and it seems like everything's a mess in a lot of ways. There's wars all over the place, and people are dying, and nobody knows how much money to send where and who to align with and all of that. And it can feel completely chaotic. And the one advantage that Christians have on the rest of the world, who do get so deeply ingrained in this paranoia and this self-preservation and this just kind of a crazy attitude. I mean, it happened. I think we've seen it heightened since COVID, because before COVID, I think a lot of people thought, well, I don't agree with certain aspects of different parties. And I think the Democrats are ridiculous, or I think the Republicans are ridiculous, but we can generally trust our government, right? Well, after COVID, a lot of people were like, nope, can't trust anything. And it's totally heightened this paranoia around every single thing that the government says and does. Whereas, and I think the Christian response should be, to seek out truth and justice in our immediate environment, whether it be locally or whatever we're responsible to. So that would be our national government as well. But to fall back on the fact that, like, it's not the end of we don't need to get paranoid. It's not the end of the world. We've got a different sort of governmental structure that we exist in that precedes and is higher above the one that we have in this physical world. And so it can, yes, you have to hold multiple things in your head at once, but I think Christians, we should be able to do that. So okay. I know we're like an hour into this, but I want to talk about the Israel Palestine, Israel Hamas war. This one to me seems to be like, and I know that Ukraine, and after talking to you, I think there's a lot more clarity to the Ukraine-Russia war, but for a long time, this one to me is just incredibly clear as to what is right and what is wrong. But you would, if you watch the news or if you listen to different commentators or talk to different Christians on this or anybody, you would think that this was one of the most perplexing, nobody can possibly know the right thing to do here situations that has ever happened in world history. So you wrote a really good kind of just a history of the conflict between Israel and Hamas / Palestine / terrorism in Israel that I want to go through with you step by step to give people a history of what's actually happened. I'm going to put the link to this in the description so people can maybe follow along if they want to, because it's important to know the history, to know what led up to what happened on October 7th, which seemed to be, for people who have been disconnected from this, like myself, like what in the world's going on? So is that, you're cool with that, right? Yeah. To just go through date by date? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I'll have to ask you a bunch of questions to know, because this all happened like 100 years before some of this stuff happened like 100 years before I was born. Okay, so we'll start back in 1917. So,
Balfour Declaration. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So explain that.
That was basically, a declaration, and some people give it a lot of weight, others don't. I think by Great Britain, expressing approval for a homeland for the Jewish people somewhere in Israel, right? And again, there was nothing binding in it. It was just an intention, right? That they should have a place and a home to call their own.
Which was important. People see that as, and we don't need to get into this if we don't want to, but like in relationship to Revelation and the end times. And I know in 1948, Israel declaring independence also. So maybe let's wait to talk about that till we get to 1948. So 1917, you have the Balfour Declaration, and then you skip ahead a little bit to 1933 to 1945, the Holocaust. And the significance here is obviously just the fact that 11 million to 20 million Jews were murdered in this time period, and that there seems to be, and the thing that I continue to come across as I was reading through this entire timeline was there seems to be what I didn't get taught when I was in school in world history is a special sort of hatred towards Jews, or a unique sort of hatred towards Jews, at least within the last 100 years. And that's obviously true because millions of them died in the World War II. So the Holocaust and Nazi murdering all these, 1/3 of the world's Jewish population is indicative of that sort of weird dynamic. Do you have any theory? I know this has nothing to do with the timeline in a way, but as to why there's such opposition to Jews, especially over the last 100 years, what is that all about?
I mean, that could be a whole podcast too,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, you could rewind to all sorts of persecution of Jews through the years, not just in by Muslims, but in Nazi Germany, but also in certain Christian countries as well throughout history. So the books, tons of books written on this. One thing that I think's heightened this in the Middle East in particular, the past 100 years or so, is probably the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood and kind of a more Islamist ideology surrounding the faith. And really, this goes back to an understanding of Islam, right? So Muslims ruled the world as it was known, Muslim leaders, for about 1,000 years. And then we have the falling apart of the Muslim Caliphate and the Ottoman Empire, right, which was somewhere around, I think, 1928 or so, right? So then you have Ataturk, who comes in and kind of creates a more moderate, kind of secular society in Turkey, which lasted pretty much until Erdogan came to power. And so, right in the wake of that, you have groups of Muslims, particularly in Egypt, but elsewhere, asking, what went wrong? Which is the title of a great Bernard Lewis book. He's one of the most well-esteemed historians of the Middle East. Wrote a bunch of books on Muslim history and Middle Eastern history. But Muslims attempted to answer that question, and particularly Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, by pointing to Islam and saying, going back to a truer version of Islam is the answer. Muslims need to revert back to the origins of their faith.
Interesting.
And that kind of created kind of a path forward for Islamists to, Islamist organizations that began to kind of take root across the Middle East and really around the world. And the rise of eventually Islamic terrorism, because this mentality then believes that there should be Muslim governments. So the Arab lands, Muslim lands in particular, should be governed by Sharia law. And if they're not, then that government is fundamentally un-Islamic, and it's okay to use violence to overthrow that government.
Yeah.
And that's why now you see the Muslim Brotherhood is actually banned in Egypt and a couple other countries. I think it's United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Isn't that interesting? Because Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. So we have all these Hamas supporters. And yet, you have Muslim, Arab countries in particular who have outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, in the United Arab Emirates, which I was there in Dubai in March, just recently, 43 members of their Muslim Brotherhood offshoot were sentenced to life in prison for being members. And it's something Human Rights Watch came out and condemned the Emirates for, and called it some sort of mass, unfair trial. And yet, this is how they've determined they're going to deal with Islamism. Right. And it's working for them, right? Because nothing else really is working, right? This is kind of a bit tangential, but I mean, you even look at efforts to prop up democracy in the region. And you look at what happened in Turkey, right, where you have Ataturk setting up kind of a secular governmental system, right? I remember being in Turkey in 2008, and headscarves are banned in public places. You can't wear the hijab, and you go to Paris and everybody's wearing the hijab. So it was this interesting dichotomy. But then Erdogan, who said when he was mayor of Istanbul, said, democracy is like a streetcar. You ride it until your destination, and then you get off. And that's exactly what he did. He used the democratic system to get elected, to come to power in Turkey, and to begin unraveling democratic reforms, freedom of the press, human rights, freedom of religion, all of those things, and basically put them on a track to become an Islamist country. You see the same thing with Hamas, right? They used democratic elections to gain power, came in, killed some of the former Hamas or Palestinian Authority members. I think they threw one off a building, and began instituting Sharia in the Gaza Strip and basically unraveling people's freedoms and abilities that and rights that they had when the Palestinian Authority was in control. They were corrupt. People didn't like the Palestinian Authority, but that's what you see with some of the challenges of trying to promote democracy in the Middle East. Is oftentimes it just doesn't work. And actually, Shadi Hamid has wrote an excellent book called Islamic Exceptionalism that talks about why. And he goes back in history and he says, just historically, for Muslims, there just really is no separation between mosque and state, right? Like in Christianity, we have given to Caesar what is to Caesar's, and what is, to God what is God's. And you just don't have that in Islam. And so that sets the stage for some of the challenges that we see, I think, across the Middle East, but particularly in this Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Well, it doesn't surprise me that the West thinks that there's certain human rights violations with trying to keep these people out of particular governments and things like that, because the West has done a very good job of totally buying into the postmodern philosophy that you can redefine whatever you want. And so if I could say I'm a Muslim, but I don't actually believe in the principles of the Muslim faith. In the West, that's totally fine. We don't view that as an inconsistency. I guess nobody really thinks about it, because if you thought about it long enough, you would realize that it doesn't make any sense. In the rest of the world, there's an objective. I mean, there's at least an objective reality as it relates to language. If somebody says that I'm a Christian, that has certain objective principles and definitions that align with it. Whereas in the West, you can redefine whatever you want. And if you say you're a Muslim, usually that would mean that you're a Muslim, like according to what that the Quran says, according to what the actual religion practices. And so in the West, there's no under people think that you can just allow Islamic fundamentalists wherever they want to go, allow them to go wherever they want to go, and that nothing bad is going to happen. But that's a complete detachment from the actual religious practices and beliefs of the Islamic religion. And it ends up resulting every single time in a bunch of people getting killed and murdered, because there's a in the Islamic faith, like you're saying, there's kind of this desire and command to implement the state, I guess, to implement the laws of the religion upon the actual physical state. Whereas in Christianity, the understanding is more spiritual, that we have the spiritual law of God, that Christ is in us, and therefore we kind of bring that to where we go in a more spiritual way. We do try to implement it because we think it's the right thing to do. Anyways, I think that that's indicative of, though, the Western kind of postmodern philosophy, that you can just say you believe something and then just do the opposite of it. So,
yeah. And there's some caveats to that too. I mean, I think from research I've done, about 10 to 15% of the worldwide Muslim population would fall in the category of Islamist or adherents to kind of a political Islam. Whereas, I think here in the United States in particular, you do have more moderate Muslims who that's just not part of their, theological aspirations. And I think even in the Middle East, you do have to be careful too. I actually spoke to the rector of Christ Church Jerusalem when I was in Israel in December. His name's David Pelegi, and greatly appreciate his perspective. He's rector of an old Anglican church right in the heart of the old city. Nice. And so he is fully immersed and well-educated on the conflict, the people, on a intellectual level, but also a very personal level. And so I appreciate that he does outreach to all different peoples of all political and religious persuasions. But, he pointed out, like, you also have to keep in mind in the Middle East in particular, some of these cultural nuances. And so he points out that, in the West, we say, I think, therefore I am. And in the Middle East, people say, I belong, therefore I am. And so much of their identity comes from belonging to a place, belonging to a people.
Right.
And I think that's why you have some of the contradiction in the polls, right? Where people will say, yes, I support Hamas, but no, I don't want to live under Hamas, or whatever it might be, right? There is an identification that takes place. And so he said, just because people say they support Hamas, don't take it at face value. Some of that's just their expression of like, I belong to these people. But in the end, like, I probably have some issues with the way they're running the Gaza Strip. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And I think also as a Christian, we have to have both conversations. We have to have a conversation about Islamism in particular, and Islam and the ideologies, eschatology, and theology surrounding that faith. And it needs to be a very serious conversation. And at the same time, we need to have an understanding of what it means to love your neighbors, to love your Muslim neighbors, and the radical notion of loving your enemies, right? And how we model that wisely, right, in certain settings and situations, but what it looks like to not have mission drift and lose that focus as a people, right, as a church.
Right. I totally agree that there can't be a fear aspect to, okay, well, if Islam is in opposition to Christianity, then we're just not going to interact with them or love them or care about them or try to spread the gospel to them. That absolutely is true. Okay. No, that's a good point. And let's move into the 1947 here. Says the United Nations General Assembly approves a partition plan that divides Palestine into Jewish and Arab states with Jerusalem under international jurisdiction. Jewish representatives accept the plan, but the Palestinians reject it. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. So basically, this was an attempt before the region was going to break out in war, because people could sense this was happening, right? Massive immigration of Jews coming into the land. And I don't have this piece pulled up in front of me, but I'm trying to remember if there's a map, probably not, of the partition plan in that piece.
Not that I can see.
Okay. This was the piece that I wrote, right, in October.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. But so if you look at a partition plan, it was basically this land, which, keep in mind, it's about the size of New Jersey, right? We have more reporters in Jerusalem than I think anywhere else in the world. And yet this is the tiniest plot of land. Like literally, you can drive from Jerusalem to Kiryat Shimona in the north in just a little over 2 hours. It's crazy. It's mind blowing when you're there. You're like, this is nuts. Like there's rockets coming from all different directions.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That's you never know. But anyway, so this partition kind of divided up in the land in a way that I think the United Nations was doing its best to be equitable. Like, where do the majority of the Jewish settlements exist and versus Arab settlements? The Jewish population accepted the plan and Arab leaders rejected it. So that kind of set the stage for war at that point. So that was an attempt to just come up with a solution. Like, you get half the cake and I get the other half the cake.
Yeah. Right. And this is the argument that I think people are making today, that it's actually a two-state solution. It won't work because historically it hasn't worked, right? Like I think that I think in one of your pieces you talked about, maybe this is or another World Magazine article talked about how there's a deep religious reality to this war. I think that might have been you, but there's a deep religious reality to this war. And when people are grasped onto what they believe belongs to them according to God, there's not going to be many, they're not going to be able to give much. They're not going to be able to kind of negotiate on that. And I think that maybe this is indicative of that. And I think that this entire war is indicative of that, which is why I think that the two-state solution is just virtue signaling at the end of the day. It's like wishful thinking. I'm a good person because I think that everybody should have land. It's like, well, I don't know. It doesn't seem like it's actually worked historically.
No, I think that's right. And I do, there's some caveats to that, but I do think it's rooted. Well, again, not all Muslims ascribe to an Islamist ideology, but generally speaking, in Islamic jurisprudence, once a Muslim land, always a Muslim land.
Sure.
It's just generally the way that these things are looked at. And so sadly, there has been a lot of propaganda and a lot of ideology that's been pumped into the school systems in Gaza and the West Bank that says, no, all of the land belongs to us. And not only that, there's not that many Jews we need to get rid of anyways. So unfortunately, they haven't been honest about how many Israelis actually, I mean, it's like 9 million live in Israel, 2 million are Israeli Arabs.
Wow.
This is not including the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but it's not going away. And for some reason, there's an uncomfortable number of Palestinians who actually still believe that it might be possible to expel the vast majority of the Jewish population from the land and implement a one-state solution, one state for Palestinians alone. And that does come from, in a large part, a religious belief.
Yeah, right. And that's, you mean just like murder? I mean, kill all of the Jews, right? There's not like an integration plan that they're going to integrate them into the culture or anything
or
like
expel.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or expel.
Sure.
Go because there's no other. I mean, there's 50 plus Muslim countries, and 20 of them speak Arabic. So, there's that, and then there's one Jewish state, tiny little place for the Jewish people, in which I believe half of the world's Jewish population lives there. Wow. So I'm not sure where they would go.
Right.
But there are, I mean, to be fair, there are Palestinians who do support and believe in a two-state solution. I'm just not sure how many do and how strong their voices are. Right.
Okay. So 1948 for a lot of Christians, this is the beginning of the end of the world, right? Because they really that way. And I don't actually know where I stand on that, but Israel declares independence on May 14th. And so you said, and neighboring Arab countries declare war. Was it that same day? Did they declare independence, and that same day they declared war on them, or how did that work?
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I think it was that same day. Yeah, it was really quick. I mean, there were already battles taking place, and so it wasn't like things were peaceful at the time, but it was an official declaration of war.
So were you in the camp of was this why you got interested in foreign affairs? Were you kind of like, okay, 1948, the end of the world starting, I should probably figure out what's going on there? Are you in a different camp?
I was. Yes.
Okay.
I'll raise my hand and admit it. Yeah. No, I was definitely in that camp of like, okay, this is the beginning of the last days. And, would even go so far as to say, like, I'm trying to remember, like, a whole timeline that I thought I had figured out. Like 1967 was kind of the reunification of and it wasn't even all of Israel historically, but I kind of had this timeline in my head, and you have X number of generations from the time that, of that reunification in 1967. So, yeah.
Wow. So I don't even know what so is the idea that when Israel becomes a nation, this is just another landmark event in the ongoing movement towards the end of the world according to Revelation? First, that question. Second question would be, what's your perspective on Revelation now that you don't think this way?
Well, first of all, I'm not really an expert in eschatology.
Totally.
I'm not sure I can answer exactly what the current thought process is or what the latest book is that's come out, right? There was what was it? The Late Great Planet Earth was the one that came out maybe 70s or 80s that I read initially. And, but my perspective now is that, yes, I do believe in the return of Christ, second coming, of course, all of those things. Right. But, I don't believe God has two different plans, one for Israel and one for the church.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. I do believe, like, as somebody who identifies more with Reformed theology, that the Old Testament covenants find their ultimate fulfillment in Christ. And so, we as a church are God's instrument, right, to spread peace and shalom and the gospel throughout the earth. Right. And is he still at work in Israel? Absolutely. Is he at work among the Palestinians? Absolutely. Right. Do I have an affinity more for the Jewish state because it's a democratic state that, is the only democracy in the Middle East? I do. And I think they're causing less problems than some of the other factions in the region.
Right.
But that also doesn't mean I am willing to write them a blank check to do whatever they want,
Right.
and that they aren't guilty of overreach in the West Bank and unfair policies at times regarding Palestinian land rights, water rights, those sorts of things. I want to be somebody who's fair-minded and understands that we are called to pursue justice in those areas.
Yeah, but there's no doubt that this Israel declaring independence is a landmark event historically, right? And
for sure.
Yeah. So what was it about Israel declaring independence in 1948 that was historically important? Because it's the first time in how long that they had been an independent state. I actually don't know. Do you know how long it had
Well, I
been?
mean, I guess when we'd have to go way back to,
Right.
okay, you're making me say dates now. Let's see, 722 BC, 586 BC. I think, aren't those the dates that the Jews were expelled, right? Didn't you have the Babylonians, the Assyrians
Yes.
taking the Jewish people into exile? I want to say 722 was the Assyrians, 586 was the Babylonians.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go with that. Yeah, it sounds like it's in the right range.
And then you have kind of the rebuilding of Jerusalem under Nehemiah.
Yep.
Oh, when was the temple destroyed? Was it 70 AD?
Yes.
I should have looked all this up.
70 AD. It was. I just had to look it. It was 20 years before. I think 20. No, not 20 years before the Apostle John. It might have been 20 years before the Apostle John died. So he had written the Gospel of John after and I think he had written the Revelation before the temple was destroyed, but the Gospel of John afterwards. I think so. But you're right. Anyways, yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So it's been a long time.
Very long time, thousands of years.
Just say that, right? Yeah. And then you had Jewish people living all over the world, right? In Europe. And I think a lot of people don't know too that, a lot of them were dispersed throughout the Middle East, right? So the Assyrian Empire is modern day Iran. The Babylonian Empire is modern day Iraq. You had Egyptian populations, Jewish populations in Egypt. All across the Middle East. And, I think the term that a lot of people use for that kind of segment of the Jewish population are Sephardic Jews. And so a lot of them were part of the Aliyah, the immigration into Israel after Israel became a nation. And a lot of them speak Arabic, right? And actually can kind of blend in pretty well with the Arab population. Some of them a little bit darker skin. Right. And so it kind of dispels this whole notion of like, that you see among like liberation theology and, people saying, hey, this is white oppression. Right. Well, actually, no, I actually ran into a whole group of Ethiopian Jews when I was in Israel in December. So,
Yeah. The liberation theology stuff is it's wild. We'll go into 1948 to 1949, Arab-Israeli War, Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, later Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq joined forces in an attempt to terminate Israel's statehood ambitions. More than 700,000 Palestinians flee their homes, while Israel absorbs nearly 600,000 Jewish immigrants expelled from Muslim countries. Israel wins the 10-month war, but Egypt gains control of the Gaza Strip, and Jordan takes over the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and its Jewish, Muslim, and Christian holy sites. So this seems like a major event. Would you consider? Yeah. So explain this even further. 700,000 Palestinians flee, 600,000 Jewish immigrants expelled. That's wild. That's a lot of people. So explain this a little bit more.
Yeah. Essentially you have kind of a population exchange, but not really, right? Because a lot of those Palestinians, they left their property, they lost their olive trees. Of course it's called the Nakba. And of course it was really sad for them. I think some of it was Israeli army military forces moving in. Some of it was Palestinians leaders saying, hey, we need to clear this area. You can come back later. Right. So I think it was kind of a little of both. But they were never really resettled anywhere outside of Israel. And so that's one of those things where you look at what was in 1947, where you had kind of that population exchange between Pakistan and India, right? You had that division, and there was like millions of Pakistanis and Indians who just kind of swapped places, right?
Wow.
Because there wasn't any way for them to really come to terms and live peaceably with one another.
Yeah.
This one was brought on by war, but you can see it created a situation where you have Palestinians who never really were resettled anywhere else.
Right, right. It's so interesting listening to this because it does feel like the Middle East and even just the rest of the world is so much different than how Americans think about things. Because we're in the melting pot, we just have all these different cultures and we've coexisted for 200 years. I mean, more cultures have come in and things like that, but we've generally coexisted without major, civil wars and things like that happening. And so
You've done a pretty good job. Yeah.
we've done, it's just like bizarre to hear this though, because I'm like, I assume, and a lot of young people, and I think a lot of Americans just assume that you should just be able to get along. Why can't people get along? But that's just not how the world has ever been historically. And it's not how the world is everywhere except for the United States, really. I mean, some places in Europe and in the West, generally there's this multicultural aspect, but it's just a totally different way of looking at the world. And so it's very eye-opening.
Yeah, it is.
It is, yeah. 1956. And if you want to do you want to hit on every single one of them, or are there just some major ones? Are there ones that you would say, hey, we should hit on these major ones a little bit more? I know that there's
some of them tie more directly to the situation at hand now, which I think your listeners are probably more interested in. Like 1956, whatever. 1973 was just another war, but 67 was a big one.
Okay, so explain that.
So 1967. After 1948, Jordan took control of East Jerusalem, and Egypt then was controlling the area around the Gaza Strip. Yeah. But what's important about East Jerusalem is that that's where the old city is, and so that's where all the holy sites are. And so, again, taking things back to Jerusalem and the religious component, Jerusalem is the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina, but Muhammad never actually set foot in Jerusalem. There was a night vision. I think it was called the Hijra in the Quran, where it talks about some sort of night vision trip to Jerusalem. But anyways, you have the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa Mosque up there where the temple used to exist. And then kind of below that, you have the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, where Jews consider kind of their holiest site and are there praying. And of course, the very religious ones are praying for their own temple to be rebuilt, which would be up there where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is, right? So there's always tensions there. And when Jordan controlled that area from 1948 to 1967, Jews were not able to worship at the Wailing Wall. They were prohibited from entering their holiest site for worship. So that old city was essentially kind of cut off to them. Right. And it was under Muslim Jordanian control at the time. So when the War of 1967 happened, it was a very decisive victory for Israel. And so they gained back control of all of Jerusalem, including East Jerusalem and the Old City complex, which has a Muslim quarter, Jewish quarter, an Armenian quarter. It's a fascinating place to be. And but then they also gained control over the Sinai Peninsula, which they eventually gave back in negotiations, and then also the Gaza Strip. And in the process, I think it's in my story. Was it 1 million Palestinians then?
Yes, 1 million Palestinians. They had to figure out how to manage
their jurisdiction. Which now has exploded to 5 million, right? Because of high birth rates among Palestinians. So what was what do we do with 1 million Palestinians is now okay, now we have 3 million in the West Bank and 2 million in Gaza.
Yeah, right.
That's 5 million total, plus 2 million Israeli Arabs that Israel absorbed into their population who, serve as lawyers and doctors and are able to vote, don't have to serve in the IDF, right? have political parties and all of that. So, yeah.
Okay. And that was a huge event. I assume the next large event would be 1978, 1979. Jimmy Carter brokers the Camp David Accords.
Yes, peace treaty with Egypt.
And so, can you break down what the Camp David Accords are and kind of what that meant?
Well, that was kind of a landmark peace treaty between Egypt and Israel that really paved the way, for further negotiations. And it was really,
Sure.
I believe Egypt was the first country to really accept the existence of Israel, right? Because remember, prior to that, it was just, no, you can't be here,
Right.
right? Like, we are all joining forces to wipe you off the map. No two-state solution, right? Rejected the 1947 partition plan. So this was a landmark move. It was not necessarily the most popular thing among Egyptians or among, the wider Middle East region. But it was one of those things that kind of paved the way for future acceptance of the Jewish state. And I think generally that's actually grown. Right.
Really?
And we can discuss the other peace treaties, but I mean, there have been some good things that have happened that have come out of that and have continued to spread across the Middle East. And we can talk about that too, but some of it also comes from Iran vying for regional hegemony in the region.
Well, then it says here in 1987, which a little less than 10 years later, around 10 years later, Hamas is founded. So how did Hamas come out of that? And I actually, first off, what is Hamas and how does Hamas come out of what seemed to be like 10 years earlier, the beginning of some sort of acceptance, like you're saying, some sort of acceptance of Israel? Hamas seems like they're very much in opposition to Israel. So how does Hamas come out of that? And what is Hamas?
Yeah. So remember, you have these tensions in the Middle East. You have kind of like Arab nationalism and people really wanting to boost and prop up the prestige of Arab states and movements towards modernization and being part of global conversations. And then you have, like I mentioned, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna's movement that kind of began, I think, somewhere in the 1920s, maybe 1928. And you have kind of these Islamist strains with radical elements beginning to take root in places like Egypt. And Hamas was an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. So they're just one more radical group that was formed in order to try to wipe Israel off the map. They have some Islamist beliefs and some eschatological undertones. And they believe that the existence of the Jewish state is preventing kind of a last days end time scenario in which Muslims will once again rule with Sharia law and be kind of global leaders on the global stage. Yeah. Wow. So, and remember too, like the Palestinian Authority was a terrorist group as well that wanted to wipe Israel off the map. It moderated eventually under Yasser Arafat after many, many years and suicide bombings throughout Israel and the PLO being expelled from Jordan and, being expelled, kicked out of Lebanon and having to flee to Tunisia. And they, eventually moderated, but there was, a lot of skepticism about how long that would last. But Hamas wasn't satisfied with what they did, especially after they began to moderate in their discussions and negotiate with Israelis. And so I think that kind of also set the stage for Hamas.
And so was this a small group of people at that time in 1987 as Hamas is founded? Was this just a kind of a minority group, or was there a lot of people with that ideology? I guess what constitutes being founded as kind of
that's a good question. I'm not actually sure how strong their support was or how many people they had. I know it wasn't as organized and formalized.
Sure.
I think it was only, under Sinwar and Mohammed Daif more recently in the past 10 or 15 years, where they've really organized into brigades and
Mm.
got training from Iranian bases in Lebanon and really grown in numbers.
Yeah.
But I think back then, it was definitely smaller in terms of numbers, but I couldn't tell you exactly how many
Sure.
people.
Sure. And the very next thing it says it's the first Palestinian uprising angered by what they say is unjust treatment by the Israeli government. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza staged protests that turned violent and evolved into a years-long uprising. Some 160 Israelis and more than 1,000 Palestinians died in the violence. Can you make is there still at this point in 1987 to 1993, I assume there's still a distinction between Palestinians and Hamas, less so than there is today, whereas Hamas is kind of running the Palestinian government and the majority of Palestinians are in agreement with the Hamas ideology. Is that safe to say or no?
Yeah, I mean, polls are tricky things, right? So we can talk about that. Really tricky things. But yes, I would say, Hamas had not quite gained traction yet. It was really the Palestinian Authority that was calling the shots and at least attempting to run the government. And yes, the West Bank is like really well, and at the time too, even Gaza, right? They had like 8,000 or 9,000 Israeli settlers in Gaza who were living there. Much smaller area, right? Gaza is tiny. West Bank's a much bigger area. But yes, I mean, the West Bank's a mess. And I think that's kind of what instigated some of these riots and kind of that first intifada and really the second intifada. Like Israel's had a really difficult time figuring out what it looks like to govern these areas. It has not been easy. So I sympathize with them. At the same time, sometimes you get these right-wing governments. You have, Zionism that kind of comes into play, and ultra-Orthodox who also have kind of a religious ideology that can, negatively impact the situation on the ground and put undue pressure and persecution to Palestinians, to those who are even peaceful. I'm not saying that all of them are. There are quite a few, particularly in the West Bank, with radical ideologies. But I've also met with a lot of people who are just trying to live their lives and raise their families. Right? That certainly exists.
Yeah, absolutely. And so after the founding of Hamas and kind of this uprising, the Palestinian uprising, what then would you say is kind of the next landmark event? I mean, there's a lot. I mean, there's it's like year after year after year, some sort of conflict happens. But what would you say is the next sort of major conflict?
Well, I would say kind of one of the big turning points. I mean, there's a ton of them. We could just go point by point forever. But I mean, the Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005 is definitely a big one, right? And remember the Oslo Accords? That was 1993-94, so that was important. 94 peace treaty with Jordan, right? So we're seeing like these movements towards peace. And then we see the Israelis kind of saying, okay, what are the steps we need to take to follow through with these, agreements that we've made that, that can help bring about peace in the region. So one of them was, hey, we need you guys to get out of the Gaza Strip. And that was actually not an easy thing to do. So a lot of these settlers kind of have a Zionist vision that all of this land should belong to Israelis and Israelis alone. And so that's made it very difficult for Israel to implement, some of these agreements. And so they actually had to go by gunpoint and force some of these settlers out of the Gaza Strip. And then basically turned over the keys to Hamas. Was it a bit naive? Probably. I mean, they didn't turn it over to Hamas. They turned it over to the Palestinians, and the Palestinians elected Hamas in elections. So was it a bit naive? Probably. I mean, it definitely, they were definitely trusting that they could just kind of take a step back and maybe they had to, right? Maybe they had to give it a shot. But they basically took over the Gaza Strip and turned it into kind of a a region that had kind of a communication blockade. People were isolated from conversations taking place outside of the Gaza Strip, and it became a place where Hamas was able to implement attempt to implement its vision of exterminating Israel and wiping Jews off the map. And that's kind of where they took all of their money and their funding, and started creating tunnel systems, 300 to 500 miles of tunnels throughout Gaza, and storing up weapons.
Right, like 100. How far underground? I've read all different. Like how far underground were those tunnels?
I mean, I've read all sorts of reports too, but some, I mean, a long ways underground, because I know that Israel, a long ways. I know the cement barrier that Israel created, where they tried to kind of make, and this is why Israel's being accused of apartheid, is because they did create a huge barrier that goes, I don't know, is it 20 feet underground?
Yeah, something
and then
like
a giant fence that's above ground that goes all along their border with Gaza. Yeah. But it wasn't because they don't want anything to do with Palestinian people. I mean, otherwise they wouldn't have integrated 2 million of them into their own country. It was to prevent terrorist attacks.
Well, this is the ridiculous thing that I don't understand how anybody can think otherwise than what you just said. It's like, yeah, if you've got people popping up like in your churches and schools out of the ground, what are you going to do? Are you going to just like, oh, I guess this is just how it is? These are, I mean, and that's been happening for so long. Yes, you put up a wall and it goes above and below ground. It feels like a particular type of narrative is being pushed. I don't know who it's being pushed by, probably mostly from the left, but even in some, Candace Owens type people are saying similar things, and which I think she's in alignment with the left here. Is that blatant lying or deception, and just ignoring the fact that the reason that they put up barriers is not because they don't want anything to do with the Palestinian people, let's say at large, or the general population. It's because they don't want anything to do with terrorist attacks, because terrorists are coming through tunnels in the ground that they've dug and built for years and years. Like, do you think that that's just a lie? Like, I don't know. How can you look at the situation and not just say, oh, I guess that makes sense. Like if people were just popping out of the ground, and like doing terrible things.
I mean, again, I think it comes from information laundering and certain, people and outlets and bloggers or whomever only telling one side of the story. And, is there suffering in the Gaza Strip? Of course there is. But the question is like, who's responsible for it, and what are Israel's ultimate aims? They're not trying to exterminate. I mean, if they wanted to exterminate the people living in the Gaza Strip, they most certainly could do so. They have the firepower to do so.
Right.
But instead, I think, you have to really take a look at the situation on the ground in Israel. Like, for example, I was visiting in December a series of kibbutzim, like 10 different areas where Israel grows its crops that are right next to the Gaza Strip, not far from a city called Sderot. And if you look up bomb shelter capital of the world, you'll see pictures of this city. Even the playground equipment, like you got these big giant caterpillar things that kids can run through. They double as bomb shelters. Why? Because Hamas has been targeting these cities ever since it took power, and people just live under constant threat. So why don't more Israelis die? Well, because Israel has chosen to put a lot of its money, and some of the United States money as well, towards missile defense systems like the Iron Dome and David Sling and the Arrow, right? Otherwise, the numbers would be way higher. And bomb shelters, whereas Gaza does nothing to protect or Hamas has done very little, probably virtually nothing to protect its citizens. Like I spoke with a woman named Manar who lived there. She's a Palestinian Syrian woman who lived there from 2017 to 2020. And she was like, there's no bomb shelters for anybody, right? Hamas doesn't do anything to protect its people. And she talked to people who know people who've died at the hands of Hamas, but they don't feel free to talk about it because that could get you in trouble, right? And the media, the press is not a free press there. She was imprisoned twice by Hamas for ridiculous things like hosting men and women in her apartment for a gathering, Another one was
Just to
for
get
hosting a
together.
peace-oriented Zoom call with Israelis, right?
So
Like,
that's just like a get together. I mean, the first one was just like men and women just getting together, or was it for a particular reason?
no, just a social gathering.
Well,
Yeah.
that's
And somebody reported it, and she got put in prison, right?
wow. Yeah.
And then another one, yeah. So I mean, right, again,
Mm,
Islamic law implemented,
mm,
and a lot of Palestinians, I think, were not happy with these
mm,
norms, and were unhappy, and actually missed the so-called good old days when Israel had jurisdiction over the Gaza Strip, because then they had more freedoms. They could go to
sure.
movies.
Right.
Men and the sexes could mix, right?
Right.
You could eat more easily. It was still challenging, right? I'm not saying their life was great, but you could cross over the border more easily to find work in Israel. It
Mm,
was still actually possible, like even with the border challenges, and even with Israel attempting to kind of control terrorism, there were still Palestinians who were coming across the border to work. And in fact, when I
right.
was on a
Mm,
kibbutz Dorot in December, I talked to a man who said on October 7th, he got phone calls from several of their Palestinian workers who would come from Gaza, asking what was happening, panicked. And all 7 of them died on October 7th. So they
mm,
had crossed over to work. They had decided to stay. They had worked there the day before, and they decided to stay right near the border so they could work in another kibbutz the next day. And
mhm.
they got caught. They were all in a van. And he said he went and was in that city and saw them dead in their van. They never made it out. They were killed by Hamas militants.
Wow.
Um, so Hamas even goes after its own people, which is really
Right.
sad. They're
Well,
probably considered collaborators, right, with the Israeli
right.
government, since they were on a kibbutz.
Well, and it seems to be a strategy from Hamas to kind of garner the sympathy of the world to hide behind the civilians. And then when there's civilian casualties, to claim that Israel is engaging in genocide and in war crimes and things like that. And then you get people in America and in the West who, I don't know, are just not, they don't have any understanding of what is actually happening over there and all the details to what's actually happening over there, and they just see people dying, they see civilians dying, and they're very quickly willing to hop onto a bandwagon or some sort of political narrative. And you see things that are absolutely insane, like the LGBTQ plus for Hamas stuff, which I know became like a joke on
Right.
Twitter, but it's like, actually, what are you
Or
talking about?
comical.
It's insane. Yeah. It's so, and so, but it seems like, even back as far as 2005, kind of what we were just talking about, that this has been in the works from Hamas for a very long time, establishing the means to invade and potentially take over Israel has been, I guess, a goal for almost 20 years, 15 to 20 years, probably even further back, but it was started to be implemented through the government. You're saying in around 2005.
Mm-hmm.
So should people have seen this coming, I guess, or they should have? Okay.
Yeah, well, and I think Israel should have seen it coming too.
So
Um,
why didn't they?
I think they just figured. Well, Daniel Pipes from the Middle East Forum has
Mhm.
has some interesting theories around this, because he's spent decades thinking deeply about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the Arab-Israeli conflict and the
Mhm.
greater challenges in the region.
Yeah.
He would say, the Israeli government just kind of got in these patterns of placating the Palestinians, the
Mhm.
Palestinian leadership, and just, yeah, we'll give you what you want, and um, good luck, right?
Mhm.
We hope you figure this out, rather than dealing realistically with realities on the ground, right?
Yeah.
And realities of a terrorist group that is, I mean, clearly they knew they were harboring weapons and building tunnels. And, I think they were aware of those things. I think
Mhm.
they just figured they could manage it with all this great technology that they have, right?
Right.
All of
Right.
these defense systems. Um, but as they found out on October 7th, it only protects you so far, right? It can
Yeah.
only do so much to protect the population. And
Mhm.
Hamas came up with a different strategy
Mhm.
to cross the border and to get in and to commit just absolute horrors and on the Israeli people.
Right.
unspeakable things that, I'm sure most of us are aware of at this point, due to the GoPro videos that the Hamas militants were wearing.
Right. Right. And I think, okay, so I think we probably could continue to talk about the history, but I think it's important, and I want to move into talking about implications slash maybe Christian perspective on this entire conflict. But the reason why, I mean, maybe some people listening being like, well, okay, why do we just go through like 100 years of history? Well, I think it's one reason is because I think Gen Zers and millennials have no idea what the history is, and they're willing to hop on whatever popular political bandwagon they find, which has been ones that are completely incoherent, like the LGBTQ plus for Hamas, or just the fact that Israel is this genocidal. Their whole goal is to just kill as many civilians as they possibly can, which is the general left-wing narrative, and the general progressive narrative is that Israel just wants to kill people. They're just genocidal, and Netanyahu is some crazy warmonger and has no sort of, he's not doing this in defense in any way, shape, or form. He loves the opportunity to kill as many people as he can, which I think, hopefully for people listening, understanding the history might give a better I guess a better understanding to the fact that these decisions made by Israel aren't being made in some sort of vacuum. There's certain historical events that have happened, and there's a particular pattern with Hamas, with Palestine, with people who hold this sort of radical ideology that the Israeli defense, the Israeli leadership is kind of tapping into that, saying, okay, we actually need to take the history into account and make sure that we're acting appropriately. That said, I want to hear your thoughts on Israel's response. And I know that, again, you're a journalist, you report this stuff, you talk about this stuff. And I know that there's a lot of journalists who say, okay, I'm just here to report. I'm not necessarily here to say what's right or what's wrong, but you're a Christian, and you have a responsibility to the truth and what's right and wrong and justice and things like that. I guess I just want to hear your thoughts as somebody who's covered this and who has, way more about this than I do. Do you think that the response from Israel has been appropriate? Do you think it's been proportionate? And do you think it's been right?
I mean, I'll be honest, this is the one that's probably kept me up at night the most.
Sure.
And it's been the one that's been the most difficult question for me to figure out how to approach and dive into from a Christian perspective. And there's a couple different reasons for that. One is because I know the history, because I know the ideology of Hamas, because I know that, there's very little hope that a two-state solution will work because of these radical elements. I know that it leaves Israel very few options on the table for pursuing peace, right? They never have had many great options. And I don't see, particularly right now, a two-state solution as a viable option to put on the table.
Sure.
So, you have to keep that in mind. I think also the regional calculus with Iran kind of is the centerpiece really in both of these wars, right? They're sending drones to Russia. They're supplying Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is continually firing rockets into Israel. And that is just a ticking time bomb, right? Like I was up in Kiryat Shimona, and it's kind of like a ghost town up there right now because they've evacuated like 60,000 people, maybe more from that region. They can't move them back because there's a whole tunnel system there too. Wow. And there's been evidence of Hezbollah planning a similar Hamas style attack on those northern border towns.
Yeah. Wow.
As what Hamas did. So that is a ticking time bomb. And I think, they have like 150,000 missiles that could potentially be lobbied into Israel. And if that's the case, it would overwhelm, right? So I read somewhere, like if they did like 4,000 a day, it would overwhelm their missile defense systems and people would die. So Israel's got that component as well. Right. So you have to remember, it's not just about how do we get, Hamas under control and get rid of Hamas. And then don't forget the Houthis down in Yemen, right? Also firing rockets into Israel, one of which I think there was some sort of recent drone that made it to Tel Aviv or something that came from the Houthis that killed somebody in Tel Aviv. So they're surrounded by enemies. And so I know, so that's a factor, right? So I'm looking at it thinking, what does Israel do? Right? Like if this were us and our enemies were surrounding us,
right.
and
Canada,
they were right on our
Mexico,
border.
right, right.
Yeah, and we're the size of New Jersey, right?
Yeah,
Like
right.
we are kind of an island on our own in the Middle East. Granted, backed by United States and other allies, but we're not sending boots in the ground there. What does it look like to protect our people? And I think that's the big question. And I think there's really government, for all its political divisions and disagreements and chaos, is pretty unified. This isn't just Netanyahu. I think because Netanyahu has his faults for sure. They're pretty unified in saying we got to go after Hamas. Like Hamas cannot be there anymore. And I think we would do the same. Now, the question that I wrestle with, right? So you have all this like just war theory, right? And all the major like aspects and fine points of that. I think the one I wrestle with the most is, what is a too disproportionate of a response in relation to the viability of getting a positive outcome? And so to boil that down, the question is it possible for them to go in and get rid of Hamas, right? Or is this just going to be an endless cycle of Palestinian deaths, right? And, I've heard, I'm not an expert in the numbers. So, I think it's important for journalists to say, I wasn't in Gaza, right? I did not go. And even if I did, I would have to go with Israeli troops, and I would only see, what I can see with their protection. I cannot imagine the suffering that Palestinians are experiencing right now. I mean, I've seen the stories, I've heard it. It's awful. And I think from a Christian perspective, we have to acknowledge that there is great suffering, and we should be deeply saddened by that.
Right.
I do question the numbers. I think we all, at this point know that we can't trust the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry.
Yeah.
But we know that the numbers are high, right? And I think we know that there's civilian deaths. Is it an unusual amount of deaths for urban warfare in a place where they're fighting a war? We've never fought one in tunnels. I don't think this is our war for us to weigh in as experts on, because, we're experts on our border. Like that's what we specialize in. We should be anyways.
Yeah.
I don't know what grade we get on that, but it's Israel's job to be experts on their land and their borders. So I think only they can answer that question. And I can say the patterns I've seen in the past are they give civilians the heads up. And what does that do? That gives Hamas the advantage, right? If they're doing knock on the roof things that let civilians know that they're about to bomb that building, they're also letting Hamas know they're about to bomb that building. So for the most part, what I've seen in the past is that they do their best to protect civilian lives. Right. I can't say if that's the case in every situation in Gaza, but I do know that's the ethos generally. But do they have the ability to fully extract and exterminate Hamas? I'm not sure. I hope so.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, no, I think I think there's a lot of difficulties that poses, though, right? If Israel is kind of saying, "Hey, we're going to bomb this building, we're going to send an attack here," and you're saying, "Yes, that's for the Palestinians." Also, inevitably, Hamas kind of knows what's coming. That makes it difficult to actually achieve anything in certain ways. I mean, you do achieve certain things and certain outcomes, but if you don't have the element of surprise, that's usually really helpful in war. Now, I think that the question of proportion, which I think is the main question that a lot of people are asking in the United States, what's the proper proportion? How much should Israel respond? I guess, my perspective has just been, I think that they should respond in direct philosophical, in equal philosophical proportion to what their enemies are advocating for. So for Hamas, it's let's get rid of Israel. And for Israel to say, well, then let's get rid of Hamas would seem to be like a just, fair sort of philosophical approach to this war. And for some odd reason, people on the left in the United States seem much more sympathetic towards Israel trying to get rid of Hamas the entire state, which would mean that a lot of civilians would have to be killed for that to happen, but seem totally in opposition to Israel saying, okay, well then our response is going to be, let's get rid of Hamas, which means that some Palestinian, there's actually probably a decent amount of Palestinian deaths is going to have to occur for that to happen. The lodge, I just don't understand where the disconnect is, because I'm fine with Netanyahu in Israel saying the only right response here is to eliminate the threat completely. But yeah, and we can wrap this up here because I got a dinner to go to. But this has been very, very helpful for me, and I think for listeners to understand what's actually happening and the complexity of the issues across the world that we don't have to deal with here in the United States. But that said, is the proportionate, I guess, yeah. What do you think about that? The philosophical thing there, where it's like, yeah, you have to respond in relationship to what the enemy is actually doing to you and what their goal is for you and for their attack on you. What do you think about that response from a Christian perspective and just from a war perspective? Dealing with war.
Yeah. I mean, it is. I think that question is probably one of the most, like I said, one of the most difficult questions to answer. And I mean, Israel has a responsibility again to protect its people. I think one of the things that's difficult for me too, though, is just how much of this is continuing to feed radicalism. At what point is it feeding radicalism in the Gaza Strip? I don't know, right? Like, I don't know. I question some of the polls. I know from what I've heard, there's a lot of discontent with Hamas, and a lot of people do blame Hamas for this war. But I've seen polls showing crazy amounts of support for Hamas that are disturbing, right? And hard to get your head wrapped around. The reason I question those polls is because I'm not sure people feel free to speak their mind in Gaza in particular. I don't question them in the West Bank. I question that in Gaza, because from what I'm hearing from people, there are a lot of Palestinians who are very upset, and they know that Hamas knew what would happen, and that it would greatly impact the Palestinian people, and that bothers them.
Yeah.
But the longer this goes and the more suffering that people experience, I do wonder if it creates fertile ground for Hamas to recruit among people. So that would be one of my, questions I have. And I don't have a good answer to that. And this is where I, as a journalist, have had to learn how to live with some of that tension. Being unable to go and report on the ground in Gaza and really talk to the people. I just don't know. It's secondhand information, and I don't trust a lot of that information that's coming through.
Right.
So, but again, this is existential for Israel, and I think it's representative of a wider attempt to exterminate the country that goes beyond just Hamas. And so, I think if you're Israeli, you're looking at this from a very different perspective than, say, somebody, sitting in Orange County, California, for example.
Yeah. I mean, would you say maybe some advice would just be, because I feel myself being this way in certain ways, but I think a lot of younger people tend to be incredibly emotionally responsive to something before they actually begin to look at what's really going on, especially politically. There's just this visceral emotion, and then you start to get the facts. And maybe sometimes you realize, oh, I was wrong, or you just listen to the facts that kind of reaffirm your emotional reaction. Would you say people should just take a step back, try to figure out where they're getting their statistics and their facts from and their news from, and see if those are the right sources, the proper, the truthful sources? And I mean, because you're even saying, as a person who's looked deeply into the situation, you've talked to many people involved in this situation, it's really difficult for you to even make certain calls here as to what the right thing is to do and what's the wrong thing to do. To me, it feels like that's kind of to say to the general population who isn't looking into it as much as you are, like, take a step back and actually try to figure out where you're getting your information from before you start to make these really polarized claims or these ignorant claims. Would you say that's okay?
For sure, for sure. And I would say in both of these wars, right? Like, be
Mm-hmm.
really careful where
Mm-hmm.
you're getting your information, and make sure that that person has been on the ground and is telling the whole story, right? Because
Right.
you can be in Gaza City and reporting on the horrors of the war, but you're not looking at why and who's
Yeah.
responsible, and the wider picture.
Right.
And I think it's important to navigate all of these things carefully, talk to the
Mm-hmm.
people on the ground, and
Mm-hmm.
have a greater understanding of all the different players and all the different components, right?
Mm-hmm.
For
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely. So I will have to wrap this up, but for a couple of things I want to say is, one is I think that this has been very, very helpful. I know that some people might be like, okay, well, we just talked about like the history of two wars and the general history. We could probably talk for like 8 hours if we want to get to the serious details of each one of these wars and all of the things that led up to invasions and war and things. But we gave a general overview. You gave a general overview as to what is actually happening in both of these wars. And I think that this is one, thank you, because I think this is very, very helpful. I think young people like myself, and people listening to this podcast who tend to be between 18 and 30 years old are just getting different opinions thrown at them constantly about how you should think about this. And you're immoral if you're not on the side of Ukraine, or you're immoral if you're not on the side of Russia, or you're immoral if you're on the side of, and I think there's some truth to some of those claims, right? But then rooting them in the facts and in the history and in the actual facts of what's actually happening right now is incredibly helpful. And I can begin to help people wrap their head around how a conservative and a Christian should approach these sorts of complicated geopolitical foreign affair problems that they're foreign to us. We don't really know how to deal with the cultures that are across the ocean and how they interact with the world, which is completely different than how we interact with the world. So all that to say, like, your reporting has been helpful for me. I've read a decent amount of it. It's very helpful to go through the history. And before we leave, do you want to maybe give some encouragement to some people who are like, oh, we just talked about war for 2.5 hours. What do I do? So give some encouragement, and then we can wrap it up.
Sure. One of the things I absolutely love about my job, even though I am reporting on atrocities, some of which are really hard to get my head wrapped around and very difficult to report, is the fact that I also get a front row seat to what the church is doing abroad, and sometimes in very difficult situations. And I find that really encouraging. And so there's a couple people I could tell you about. One is Oleg Magdich. He's a pastor in Ukraine, currently serving on the front lines, doing kind of evacuations of wounded troops. And I think what I've appreciated about Oleg's perspective through the years, and I've interviewed him and talked to him quite a lot and FaceTimed him, and is just, he is willing to sacrifice for his country. He's willing to die for his country. But more than that, he sees this as an opportunity for God to strengthen the church in Ukraine. He sees this war as something that God is at work in and through, despite the suffering. Right. And he has pointed out how churches are serving people who are suffering, and many are seeking truth. They're seeking the gospel through great hardship and trials and challenges. Wow. He also has asked that, we pray for the church in Ukraine. If Russia does take over, Protestant Christians in particular will be at great risk. Wow. And we have great reasons to, we know, right? We've seen this in Russian controlled territories where, people have been, pastors, Christian leaders have been tortured and killed. Churches have been taken over and confiscated by Russian troops and accused of collaborating with the West. So, so they're fighting for more than just their country. They're fighting for religious freedom. Yeah. But his hope and his faith is in Christ alone. And that is where he finds his comfort, and the ability to wake up each morning and go serve his country, leave his wife and sons behind in Kyiv, and go to the front lines. So there's Oleg.
Yeah.
And then I think in Israel, it's a complicated situation where, you have a lot of Christians who think the Israeli government is friendly to Christians. Is not necessarily the case. There's a lot of Messianic Jews who've tried to immigrate there, who've been blocked from going. There's been a lot of attacks by ultra-Orthodox on churches and Christians in Israel. And then, you have the Arab Christian population that's, caught between two different people groups, and neither of which do they feel are really welcoming to them.
Yeah.
And yet you see people serving in great capacity. I think the thing that encouraged me is I talked to a lot of pastors and visited quite a few pastors when I was in Israel in December, who are faithfully serving in the midst of war and finding unique ways to do so. And of course, most of that's taking place among the Jewish population, caring for people whose husbands are off at war, who are stuck at home with, children that they're trying to manage. But also a lot of these churches said they have teams of people prepared to go into Gaza once this war ends, and to help and serve among a really suffering population. And to me, I find that very inspirational, that their heart is to be peacemakers and people who bring hope in a situation that really seems hopeless, right? And we don't know how this is going to end. We don't know what this is going to look like. It's one of those wars, like, with Ukraine, it's pretty clear cut. Like, we just want Russia out. This involves crazy, negotiations and things that have never been resolved for decades. So, and yet you see Christians, even in the midst of that, in the midst of suffering and, people wanting revenge and deep hurt, figuring out and navigating ways to bring peace and share the love of Christ, and really model this message of loving your enemies. And I think that's profound. And I think it's something that, we should just pray for those churches and those people to have opportunities to do so, right? To be able to minister to both Arabs and Jews.
100%. Yeah, no, that's very good. It's very good to know and to just hear stories of Christians across the world that are actually facing persecution. In America, we throw that word around when we don't get the political candidate that we like in office or something like that. We say we're facing persecution, which is ridiculous. And these people are actually facing persecution. They're facing death every day, and it hasn't affected their faith. It hasn't. They still have faith in Christ, and they're still willing to go out and spread the gospel and to do what is right and try to make the best decision in the situation that they're in, which should be like a lesson to all of us in America who have it fairly easy. Even though we feel things heating up politically, we aren't having to face those sorts of life and death situations on a daily basis, which should mean that we should be so much more willing to go out and spread the gospel. And sadly, that might not be the case for a lot of Christians in the United States, but we should look at these other people who are willing to do that in the face of death and say, well, I should probably be doing it when I'm not facing death. Right. That is, yeah. So, well, Jill, thanks for doing this. This is a super long podcast. Thanks for giving me your time and for your reporting and for the clarity that you've brought to me and hopefully to the listeners on both of these wars and how Christians should think through this and things that we should even be encouraged by within the bad situations. Just thanks so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Andy. Yeah, I enjoyed this. This was a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks. And for those of you listening, make sure you like, subscribe, share with their friends, give us a 5-star rating, leave a review, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.